Hello, my name is Ted Turneau, and welcome to an online PowerPoint presentation on the life and thought of Pierre Bourdieu. Not Bourdieu. Bourdieu is a wine. Bourdieu is a human being, or was a human being. But this is primarily for my Understanding Media Fandom class. And if you are part of that class, then you should know that after you watch this, go to the Neo forum and post one question that you would like discussed in class regarding this lecture, okay? And then we'll discuss it in class. If you're not part of my class at Anglo-American University in the Czech Republic, then welcome. You're more than welcome to sit in and listen, and I hope you will find it of interest. So, the life of Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Félix Bourdieu was born in 1930 to a lower middle class family in Denguin, a small town in southwestern France. His father was the village postman. He spoke the local dialect of the remote rural region of Béarn. To put it mildly, he was not from a sophisticated urban background. He was, as we say in the United States, from the sticks. He was from the boondocks. Or as the French would say, he was provincial. He was, however, a gifted student and was admitted to a gymnasium first in his region and then a prestigious and very competitive gymnasium. And for those of you who don't know what a gymnasium is, it's sort of a high school university prep school. A very competitive gymnasium in Paris called the Lycée Louis le Grand, and from there into the International Teachers School, the École Normale Supérieure at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he prepared for state philosophy exams. But he was, because of his background, always an outsider. And he expressed that feeling of alienation in the form of sharp criticism against his peers, his professors, and even the school itself. One of his ENS schoolmates remembers Bourdieu being motivated by, quote, an extraordinary desire for revenge, close quote, against the Parisian intellectual elite that dominated the school. Bourdieu was frustrated that French academia spoke in terms of the lofty goal of universalism, liberté, fraternité, égalité, blah, 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 the brotherhood of man and all that, but acted in reality in a highly elitist way. French academics spoke of truth, but then defended a curriculum based upon tradition, furthering scholarship that had little to no empirical evidence to back it up. This attitude of alienation and aggressive criticism colored his approach to all social institutions, and he came to see this critical approach as indispensable to the practice of sociology itself, and indeed to his role later as a public intellectual. So this is a quote from him. What I defend above all is the possibility and necessity of the critical intellectual, who is firstly critical of the intellectual doxa secreted by the doxosophers. So what is this doxa that is secreted by the doxosophers? Doxa for Bourdieu is his way of talking about the assumptions and rules and the givens of a certain field of discourse, whether that's in academia or in art, the art world or whatever. Whoever is guardian of the rules or the way it's always been done, those are the people who need to be attacked by criticism, because they are the keepers of the doxa. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. In post-World War II France, There were fierce debates as to the future political direction of the country. There were, first of all, those who supported the Communist Party, and the Communist Party was kind of popular because of their role in the resistance. There were those who were Marxist but were critical of the Communist Party. And then there were the existentialists who were more or less concerned with individual liberty. Even École Normale Supérieure, the school, had its own Communist Party cell group that was influenced by the great structuralist, Marxist literary and cultural scholar Louis Althusser, who's the guy with the pipe, not the beardy guy, that's Karl Marx. What faction Bourdieu belonged to is a matter of debate. Bourdieu said he did not join the Communist Party and was even a part of a committee to defend the liberties of those who were denounced by the school's communist cell. But the leader of the cell says differently and said that Bourdieu came to all the cell reunions when they had class reunions, which is a claim that Bourdieu fiercely denied. No doubt he was at least influenced by Althusser, as were other intellectuals who went to ENS, like Michel Foucault, though later Bourdieu criticized Althusser's Marxism quite harshly. After graduation in 1955, Bourdieu, like many graduates, went to teach philosophy in the gymnasiums in the provinces. When the war with Algeria began, he was called into military service, but because of his opposition to the war, he was sent back to Paris, which is maybe the most French thing ever. Off you go, fight for your country, but I don't want to. Oh, okay, well, off you go then. See ya. That's not something Americans are familiar with. Bourdieu pursued a teaching position in sociology without, however, taking the state doctorate exam. And so he was not allowed to preside over dissertation defense committees. Bourdieu was once more marked as an outsider. Sociology at the time was weak and poorly institutionalized as a discipline, but it was also not as overpopulated with scholars as philosophy was. So it gave Bourdieu the chance to create something from scratch. To prepare to teach in sociology, Bourdieu did anthropological fieldwork in Algeria, teaching himself ethnography, and it was through his fieldwork there that he became aware of his own social positions, his own method, by contrasting it with something quite different, that is, Algerian culture, the culture he was studying. He came back to France to teach, finding an important sponsor in the guy on your left, Raymond Aron. He headed up Aron's European Center for Historical Sociology, where Bourdieu gathered a team of scholars with whom he would work for the rest of his career. After a falling out with Aron over their different reactions to the student protests of May 1968, Aron defended the university status quo too much for Bourdieu's taste. Bourdieu left to form his own Center for European Sociology, though the two had a lasting mutual respect even after their break. As a matter of fact, Bourdieu was not an enthusiastic supporter of the student movement and remained silent until he was securely entrenched in the prestigious Collège de France, the Sorbonne, some months later. He was a sharp critic of France's educational system, but he was skeptical about just what the student protests could hope to achieve. In his career as a sociologist, he sought to establish sociology not only as an academic discipline, but more importantly as a profession based on research. He founded his own journal when he and his collaborators' articles were not published in the established scholarly journals, like Acts of Research in the Social Sciences here. Later in his career, Bourdieu shifted from producing research essays to giving interviews in the media and writing political essays critiquing neoliberalism and globalization for the popular press. That is, he became known as a public intellectual. He also invested time in becoming known internationally, spending time in North America and other European countries and Japan. And then he died of cancer at the age of 71 on January 24th, 2002. All right, that's his life. What about his key ideas? And no, we're not taking a break to answer questions. Bourdieu's key ideas. Bourdieu's impact on both social theory and fan theory comes principally from his 1984 book, Distinction, A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. It was a huge research project that Bourdieu turned into a book some 600 pages long, including footnotes and appendices. And he didn't do all the research himself. He had a team working on it, but he was the lead researcher, and so he gets to have his name on the cover. The research objective was to, quote, identify the cognitive structures which social agents implement in their practical knowledge of the world and which are internalized, embodied social structures. And if that sounds kind of abstract, hold on. It'll become a little more apparent later. So, in other words, he wanted to complicate the subject-object distinction. Now, at this point, I need to ask a somewhat embarrassing question. Do my listeners understand what is meant by the subject-object relationship? And a lot of times, unless you've got a background in philosophy, you won't understand what it means. So let me explain it to you really simply. Subject, and you can hear this in the word subjective, or the subject of a sentence, means your internal self, like everything that has to do with the you, or if I'm talking about me, the me, right? And object is everything else in objective reality, everything else around you, other people, other things, and stuff like that. So it's basically the distinction between self and world, self and environment. Okay? So for Bourdieu, this distinction between subject and object is a fuzzy one. It's not distinct because for two reasons. Subjects tend to project their own patterns, expectations, assumptions onto the world they experience, and contrary-wise, the structures of the social world that surrounds them press in on the subject's consciousness, causing them to conform or creates a dissonance within the subject. So the border between subject and object becomes fuzzy, very much like Emile Durkheim's understanding of social fact. There are things out in the world that press in on us and shape us, whether we like it or not, right? Or like sociologist Peter Berger's understanding of the internalization of social structures from the outside world. Likewise, his work is similar, Bourdieu's work is similar to that of anthropologist Emile Durkheim, in that Bourdieu was also interested in how societies integrate the social structures that connect people living in a given culture. But whereas for Durkheim, the end result is a social unity, like religious rituals that act as a glue that bind people together into a common moral vision, for Bourdieu, by contrast, the end result is a system of divisions, of social hierarchies, social oppressions. So in Distinction and other writings, several key assumptions surface that guide Bourdieu's analysis. Not things he proves, but assumptions that he makes that guide his analysis. And the first one is, the social order is a symbolic order that is fundamentally colored by binary relationships of domination. All right, let me unpack that. So Bourdieu does not believe that truth lies in essences or substances. It's not For Bourdieu, there is no, this is just the way things are. Rather, the truth lies in the relationships between things, and he calls this relational thinking. And he models his relational thinking on Ferdinand de Saussure's structural linguistics and Claude Lévi-Strauss's anthropology based on Saussure's linguistics. And if you're not familiar with structural linguistics, the thumbnail sketch, or the point that I'm trying to make, is that for Saussure and for Lévi-Strauss, nothing, no sign, no symbol exists in isolation. No symbol means anything by itself. It only gains meaning in contrast to other signs around it, right? So there's no such thing as chairness in any linguistic system. The sign, the word chair, only means what it means in distinction to table and floor and door and window and couch and love seat and whatever else you want to put in there, right? So, or as I say in other classes, for Saussure, a sign is what it is because it's not what it's not. Or rather, it is what it is only because it's not what it's not. It only has meaning by virtue of the contrasts, the oppositions it has with other signs that surround it. Okay? And likewise for Lévi-Strauss, in a myth, if you have a man, that doesn't mean anything. It's only when he's brought into a binary oppositional relationship with something else. If it's a woman, then it's sort of a kind of a tension between the sexes. If it's a leopard, then it's sort of man versus nature. If it's an eagle, it might be earth versus sky, right? So just having a guy, a man in a myth doesn't mean anything. It only takes on meaning in opposition to other symbols that it's in relationship with. Okay? Furthermore, Bourdieu assumes with Marx that the structure of social systems are essentially competitive. It's all about class struggle. And what this means in practice is that social symbolic representations tend to reduce to binary oppositions wherein one member of the opposition is seen as superior and the other member of the opposition is seen as inferior. Let me read this rather long quote from Distinction to show you what I mean. All agents in a given social formation, any given social context, share a set of basic perceptual schemes, that is, basic grids for interpreting the social situation, for perceiving things, which receive the beginnings of objectification, that is, the beginnings of social reality, and turning other subjects into objects, objectification, and which receive the beginnings of objectification in pairs of antagonistic adjectives, adjectives that stand in contrast to one another, commonly used to classify and qualify persons or objects in the most varied areas of practice. And then he's going to list all of these antagonistic adjectives. The network of oppositions between high, sublime, elevated, pure, and low, vulgar, low, modest, spiritual, and material, fine, in the sense of refined and elegant, and coarse, heavy, fat, crude, brutal, light, subtle, lively, sharp, adroit, or adroit if you're American, and heavy, slow, thick, blunt, laborious, clumsy, free and forced, broad and narrow, or in another dimension between unique, rare, different, distinguished, exclusive, singular, novel, and common, ordinary, banal, commonplace, trivial, routine, brilliant as in intelligent, and dull, obscure, gray, mediocre. All right, all of those, he says, is the matrix of all the commonplaces, all the common sense that we have, all of the received wisdom that we have, which finds ready acceptance because behind them lies the whole social order. That is, some of these adjectives get boosted and some of them get lowered, or some of the people get assigned these higher adjectives and others get assigned the lower adjectives because the social order supports that system of classification, right? Some people are just gonna be seen as Robins and everybody else wants to be a Batman. So the social order is fundamentally one of hierarchy and domination and an area for what Bourdieu calls symbolic violence. That is, symbolically shoving the other down in his seat like a schoolboy who won't obey the rules. I'm the one in charge here. Know your place, young man. The hierarchical symbolic order structures our perspective, our perceptual matrix, but sociological analysis can penetrate its fundamental structures that are hidden even from the participants themselves. The violence we commit or suffer that we don't even consciously acknowledge. That's the value of sociology for Pierre Bourdieu. It finds these hierarchies and these oppressions. All right, second guiding assumption is that all social action is interested, even or especially when it doesn't appear to be so. Bourdieu's sociology is influenced by German sociologist Max Weber's analysis of religion as a fundamentally self-interested activity that can look disinterested. For Weber, religious or magical systems of thought and action are always grounded in this worldly concerns. That is, religion always has some sort of material or social or symbolic payoff, even when it doesn't seem to. For Weber, religious life together in society always boils down to some sort of economics, a payoff for some sort of benefit. Why do people pray? For some sort of payoff, whether that's security or comfort or some material benefit. When a charismatic religious leader, somebody who's attractive, a religious virtuoso who really knows the religion and draws people to himself magnetically, and he draws a following, self-interest is at work. In other words, Weber has or had a materialist philosophy. There are no truly spiritual interests. Spirituality, there's only the material world, in other words. And therefore, all seemingly religious or spiritual interests have to be shown to be rooted in and reducible to material interests. Religion should be seen as social action on an explicitly economic model. People invest spiritually to get a certain payoff. Bourdieu extends Weber's idea to apply not just to religion, but to all social action. Therefore, all social action for Bourdieu must be seen through an economic lens, an economic perspective. According to Bourdieu, sociology properly analyzes all practices as, quote, oriented toward the maximization of material or symbolic profit, close quote. And that is from his book Le Sens Pratique, or I think in English it's called Praxis. Every action, therefore, is perceived by Bourdieu as having been done out of self-interest. Wherever social action appears to be disinterested, in, for example, education or intellectual discourse, even intellectual discourse on YouTube, or art, such apparent disinterestedness is actually a misrecognition, méconnaissance, which means misrecognition in French, is an important term for Bourdieu. Particularly in these seemingly disinterested cases, there is a hidden self-interest at work. The most seemingly selfless action is simply a disguise for self-interest. And here he draws upon Marxist presuppositions, that is, that social life is first of all competitive, a struggle over unequally distributed capital, that human beings are ultimately economic beings at base, but we hide that fact from ourselves through false consciousness, or what he calls illusio. So, like Marx, Bourdieu's perspective is ultimately a hermeneutic of suspicion. Now, you guys may not be familiar with that phrase, hermeneutic of suspicion. It was coined by the guy I did my dissertation on, a French language philosopher and literary theorist named Paul Ricoeur. And Ricoeur said that you can understand the way the perspectives that have marched across the West in terms of pre-modern and post and modern then postmodern is, and the difference is, pre-modern you had a hermeneutic of trust. And let me back up. What's a hermeneutic? A hermeneutic is simply a way of interpreting, a way of interpreting texts or life or whatever. So a hermeneutic of trust takes messages. Oh, and hermeneutic is a Greek word from hermeneusis, to interpret. But it comes from, like, you can even see Hermes in there, the god, the messenger of the gods, right? The one who delivered messages between the mortal world and the gods. And so hermeneutics is a way of interpreting messages. So pre-modern people, Ricoeur argues, were basically operated in a hermeneutics of trust. You tell them something and they take the message at face value. A hermeneutics of suspicion, which is a characteristic of modern discourse, takes nothing at face value, but is always looking for the hidden agenda of some sort, the subtext. So, and he said there are three modern masters of suspicion: Marx, Nietzsche, Freud. All right, for Marx, it's all about whatever the message is. It's always about economic interest and class struggle and things like that. For Freud, whatever the surface message is, it's always about sex and aggression in one way or another. It's always about libido and thanatos, the pleasure principle and the death drive, or it has to do with a messed up father figure and whatever. And for Nietzsche, no matter what the message says, it's actually about will to power. It's actually a form of manipulation in order to get power over people and things like that. So, for example, this is an example I use in my classes. I do movie discussion nights at my house, and I invite students over, and there is good food that my wife makes, and we watch a movie and we talk about it. And I invite my students, and if they're working under a hermeneutics of trust, they say, "Oh, thanks, that's really kind of you. I can come, or I can't come, or can I bring a friend?" and that sort of thing. A hermeneutics of suspicion would be more like, wait a minute, what's actually going on here? Are you getting paid for this? Do you get some, what exactly, like, it can't be that you're just inviting students over. There has to be some other thing at play here. I know. You're one of those sad academics. You're one of those sad professor types who can't have real friends, and so you make students into your friends, and that's disgusting, and please, no, I won't. I spit on your invitation. And that would be a hermeneutic of suspicion, right? So Bourdieu is working from a hermeneutic of suspicion very much like Marx. Whatever disinterested message gets sent, it's always about self-interest. It's always about some sort of payoff. But unlike Marx, interested action does not necessarily have an economic or cash payoff, which leads to the next point. The next assumption that he works with. Capital comes in different forms. So Bourdieu's economic model is so strong and so class-based that many have called him just a Marxist. He is a type of Marxist, after all. Your reading, if you're in my class, came, after all, from Marxism.org, Marxism.org. But he is by no means a typical Marxist. For Karl Marx, for classical Marxism, it all boils down to capital, cold, hard cash, ownership over the means of production, resources, and so forth. But here's where Bourdieu disagreed with Marx. The payoffs that we seek and fight for are not always given to us in terms of economic capital. Capital for Bourdieu, has a much wider meaning. For Bourdieu, it is the energy of social physics. It is the power to fulfill your self-interest in social systems. It is the engine that drives all social systems, and this capital comes in a variety of forms. Of course, there is economic capital. That's capital as we tend to think of it, and it's spelled out in terms of wealth, money, access to resources, financial clout. All right, so far so good. But there's also symbolic capital, and that is not spelled out in terms of wealth. That is spelled out in terms of legitimation, with establishing authority. Now, what is legitimation? It's important that you understand this because it's all important for Bourdieu. Legitimation has to do with seeing social arrangements as given, as legit, right? It's not just that way, but it ought to be that way. So for Bourdieu, there is no naturally legitimate authority. Symbolic capital has the power to render certain social arrangements sacred, to cause us to see them as unquestionably legitimate, when in reality, all social arrangements are arbitrary. There are, for Bourdieu, no natural hierarchies or authorities. There is no sacred for Bourdieu. Whatever claims to be sacred must be hiding something. That's that hermeneutic of suspicion. Then there is cultural capital, which, if you were in my class, this is what your reading was about. And that is spelled out not in terms of wealth or legitimation, although it's a type of legitimation, but it's spelled out in terms of distinction. That is positioning your cultural identity as marked by aesthetic and cultural superiority. Cultural taste is never simply about taste or aesthetic preference. And here's his quote from Distinction. The point of my work is to show that culture and education aren't simply hobbies or minor influences. They are hugely important in the affirmation of differences between groups and social classes, and in the reproduction of those differences, those hierarchies. Whereas these people, Delphine de Girardin and Fiona Good, for them it's just a kind of a natural thing. Good taste is the modesty of the mind. That is why it cannot be either imitated or acquired. And Fiona Good says, God knows all the money in the world can't buy good taste. All right, so those are people who think taste is just something you're kind of born with. Modesty of the mind. It's a good upbringing and whatever. For Bourdieu, it's rather more sinister. It has to do with asserting the legitimate superiority of your taste over the tastes of other groups. It is about distinction. Or if you're of a lower class, culturally knowing your place and making the best of your limited cultural capital by disparaging higher cultural distinction as too intellectual or too pretentious or not for people like us. I don't know art, but I know what I like. So cultural capital is all about distinction. It's all about your cultural position relative to other groups and their cultural tastes. And finally, social capital is spelled out not in terms of wealth or legitimation or prestige, but it's spelled out in terms, not in terms of wealth or legitimation or distinction, but in terms of prestige. And the way Bourdieu uses prestige here is who you know, and more importantly, who knows you. If you are known by more people than you know, that is a marker of prestige, a marker of your social influence, your position. You have high social capital. Think about this in terms of social media. What do we call people who a lot of people know about and they're signed up to follow them on Insta or TikTok or whatever, but they don't necessarily know that many people, right? They have 150,000 followers, 500,000 followers, and they're following like 5. What do we call those people? We call them influencers. They have a lot of prestige. That is a working out of Bourdieu's social capital, who's got power in the network, in social media. Now, each of these types of capital is unequally distributed. Some people are shut out from these resources that would give them symbolic, cultural, or social capital, or economic capital for that matter. Usually these forms of capital, especially the symbolic, cultural, and social capital, are inherited or learned in one's home and school. It is possible to have a lot of one sort of capital, but not a lot of another sort of capital. So nouveau riche people, those are people like the guy in the upper left who have a lot of money but no taste. Good Lord, how much wood painted with gold paint do you really need in a room? Really? Ugh. Or you can have the old aristocracy or the intellectuals like university lecturers who have a lot of taste but not a lot of money to display their taste. Or as a friend of mine used to call it when we were talking about speakers, stereo speakers, we got champagne ears but a beer budget. Also, in certain circumstances, these types of capitals can be exchanged or translated into other forms. So, for example, social capital can translate into more legitimacy, which would be symbolic capital. Cultural capital, that is being known for having good taste, can translate into social capital. You have prestige. A lot of people know you. Or social capital, social influence, that prestige can open doors, can give you open doors in your network and land you a lucrative job, which would give you economic capital. They are all forms of privilege that exclude the disadvantaged. So Bourdieu's is very much a systemic perspective. Interest, that is self-interest, is shown by an unconscious or semi-conscious effort to establish or maintain the status quo by the upper classes by denying these capitals to the lower classes. In this way, all symbol systems, whether educational or religious or artistic or whatever, are actually pathways of symbolic violence. They are means of maintaining domination over disadvantaged groups. In other words, social life boils down to one complex and multifaceted thing: power. Who's got it? Who wants it? Who's going to keep it? And how? And that power is expressed through the possession of these various forms of capital. All right, fourth key idea. Class struggle is expressed in different fields through habitus. So another way that Bourdieu expressed basically Marxist concerns but deviated from orthodox classical Marxism was his insistence that social domination happened not only through economic means but through a variety of fields, which would include fields of study but is wider than that. These are fields of different areas of social life, different aspects of our social life, areas or axes of struggle, of hierarchies. Domination is asserted or resisted not just economically, but artistically, linguistically, educationally, and so forth. Each of these fields has specific historically developed rules by which to play the game. Those who know the rules, and this is what Bourdieu calls doxa, and the right way. You can hear this from orthodoxy, right? The right teachings. Those who know the rules, those who know the doxa, the common assumptions governing action in a specific field, and have the rules to play, have the resources to play by those rules, they rise to the top. Those who don't are excluded or subordinated. Those who have access to the various capitals inherent in these fields, symbolic, social, cultural, economic, are at an advantage socially, and they will therefore reap greater rewards. And how does one obtain these capitals? Through what Bourdieu calls habitus. Habitus is neither purely subjective nor purely objective. He calls it a mediating structure. It mediates between the subjective world and the objective world. Social action, therefore, is not simply a mechanical response to the structures that surround us, that surround the social agent, like a reflex. It's more complicated than that. But neither is it simply a choice to live in a certain way, to have a certain lifestyle. Rather, action and choice are filtered through habitus. So what is habitus? Habitus is a shared set of dispositions and attitudes internalized through education and home life that link a social actor to a certain class. And Bourdieu mentions 4 classes: the dominating fraction of the bourgeoisie, that would be old money, social privilege, high cultural capital, high economic capital, generally high levels of social capital. There is secondly, the dominated fraction of the bourgeoisie, which are middle class intellectuals who try to use cultural capital to make up for their lack of social and economic capital. They don't have a lot of prestige, they don't have a lot of money, but they have a good bit of cultural capital. The petite bourgeoisie, the lower middle class, who possess enough cultural capital to recognize good taste, but not enough to have mastered the rules of the game, and so they are liable to carry their tastes to extremes. We call these people hipsters. And the working class, who are deficient in all forms of capital. Class affects social action only when filtered through habitus. That is, this collection of inherited and learned traits that are expressed in worldview, attitudes, aesthetic tastes, even minor things like bodily posture and ways of dressing and ways of speaking, like the accent. I've been addressing you this whole time with what is my natural accent. It is kind of Midwestern. It is kind of a combo of Midwestern and Northeastern American English, with some of the hard edges sanded off because I've lived overseas for so long. And you don't want to sound too American, you know? But if I were addressing you like this, if I talked about Bourdieu with a certain, I don't know, the royal received pronunciation, and talked about the different capitals, you might take me for someone of great refinement because I'm so very, very English and intelligent, and that would be, that would affect you. That would be a tip off to my habitus. On the other hand, if I talk to you like in a Southern Philly accent, and I talked about this guy called Bourdieu. This Bourdieu guy, he had like all these radical ideas about the differentiation of different types of social capital, of different currencies that we use in the social system, then you would think differently about who I was. Or if I talk to you like this and talk to you about Bourdieu and how this guy, he was really, real smart, he was, and he talked about how the social system is one of a complex system of divisions and hierarchies and dominations, and dadgummit, some people just don't get enough of these capitals because they just don't have a good habitus. You would also make judgments about me for that kind of voice, right? These are things that we carry with us that we are not even aware of. And and importantly, the habitus is what supplies a person with various kinds of capitals and marks them as being from a certain class. Your habitus gives you access to or restricts you from access to various types of accents. Of these types of capitals. I had a friend who did a PhD at the University of Chicago, so a premier elite institution in cultural history. Okay, and he's from a small town in North Carolina, and he talks kind of like this, and it's not real thick or nothing, but you can definitely tell that he's from the South. And he said that he had the hardest time getting his classmates and even his professors to take him seriously because of his accent. Right? That is a marker of he had a ding against his social capital and an assumed ding against his cultural capital because of his habitus. All right. Anyway, so because of habitus, the fields, though they can be analyzed separately, have what Bourdieu calls homologies. They have similar rules, similar structures of privilege. Those who have the capital set the rules of the game, set the doxa in a variety of fields, and then try to maintain that status quo. And therefore, they come to dominate the social space in its entirety. Those who don't have access to these capitals try to subvert the field in order to displace the doxa, displace those who are at the top of the game because they're privileged in that field. But of course, those underprivileged people have less capital and resources to work with. The game isn't fair. The field is tilted against those who are deprived in certain forms of capital, those who are poor in cultural capital and social capital and and wealth and so forth. And finally, distinction. Distinction, which if you're in my class, you read about this, right? That was a big part of your reading. Distinction reveals the fundamental logic of the social systems. It reveals the mechanisms of social differentiation. Through distinction, members of a given class or habitus establish their social identity for themselves by setting themselves off in contrast to members of an other group. This is what we call othering. A member of a certain group asserts a social hierarchy and dominance over other groups by othering, representing other groups to yourself and to others as defective through setting up these binary oppositions, these antagonistic adjectives, rational versus irrational, young and vital versus old and decrepit, engaged versus aloof. Nowadays, I guess it would be hot versus mid, right? Am I doing it right, fam? Am I fire? I just say that to make my students cringe. And having raised 3 children, I have a PhD in making young people cringe. So, as David Schwartz, a Bourdieu scholar, puts it, all symbolic systems follow this fundamental classification logic of dividing and grouping items into opposing classes and hence generating meanings through the binary logic of inclusion and exclusion. So this is very close to what is known as social identity theory. A guy named Henry Teifel talked about how you form social identity by othering, like by seeing others as other, right? I am who I am. We are who we are because we're not you. You guys are different than us. And if you want to know more about social identity theory, there's a helpful website called simplypsychology.org. The main difference is that, so you could see Bourdieu as a sort of a social identity theory, but the main difference is that for Bourdieu, this way of asserting identity never ever happens in a neutral, equal context. The social system is biased against certain groups and favors other groups. That is, those who have the most of these various forms of capital, and therefore this othering is at the same time a sort of domination, a sort of oppression, a social oppression. And obviously, for fandom, an application to fandom marks the fan in certain ways that have consequences in wider society. But more importantly, the logic of distinction means that invariably, fan practices will not be automatically or naturally inclusive like the first wave theorists assumed, like Henry Jenkins assumed. Fandom is just one big filk sing where we join hands. And for those of you who don't know what a filk song is, filk songs are like fan folk songs. It's a dying art. I mean, may even by this time be a dead art. I did a survey of and interviews with like 240 some people. And only one of them said filk singing was a way of expressing his fandom, and he was like 74, 76 years old. So anyway, but it was a thing back in the day, believe you me. And it was like this, everybody get into the circle and there's simple songs and everybody can sing them and everybody's part of this great family. No, fan theorists started recognizing, rather, fans set up hierarchies that may be hidden from the fans themselves, just like what happens in all social institutions, all social discourse, according to Bourdieu. Some fans will simply have greater cultural, symbolic, social capital, and economic capital so they can buy more merch and stuff, and therefore they will be marked as better. They will be marked with distinction. Okay, that's my lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will talk about it when we get to class. Please, please, please have your comments up on Neo at least 24 hours before our next class. Okay? And I hope you guys have a good week. And for those of you who are not my students, I hope you enjoyed it. You obviously don't have to do the homework. But if you come to Prague and you need a university, you know, I'm still here. All right. Take care and see you at the next lecture.